So the weight of that's going to fall on you, Lord willing, next week. Brother Joe is going to share some pictures from their visit to the Ark encounter. Tonight, we're looking at a section of the Bible, of God's Word, that I'm sure many of us are very, very familiar with. I mean, this is material that we oftentimes teach to our young people, young children, as they're going up through ages, 1, 2, 3, into preschool and first grade and things of that nature. But when we're considering what the Bible is teaching, do we really need to grow so familiar with information to where we start considering, well, I already know all about that? If you think about it, that's a problem that the first century individuals had when it came to Jesus, was it not? We have a saying about familiarity. What does familiarity breed? Contempt. Now, why is that? I mean, it's a saying for a reason, because there's some truth to it. I don't know why that is. The more that we seem to know about something, the more that we're involved in a particular event or what have you, just the less we feel towards it. It just becomes commonplace. You take, for example, I'm sure, different ones of you in your homes, you have maybe pictures that hang on your wall, and when you first put it up on that wall, you recognize it. Every time you walk by it, you look at it. What about now? You walk by it, you don't even know that it's there anymore. You're familiar with it. Well, when Jesus was here on the earth, what were the Pharisees? What were the other Jews saying about Jesus? They were familiar with Jesus, were they not? What were they saying about him? Do we not know this Jesus? Is he not Joseph, the carpenter's son? Are not his brothers and his sisters here with us? See, just because we're familiar with somebody or something does not actually mean that we know everything that we need to know about it. And so when we're considering these sections and these chapters of the book of Genesis, we need to try to go back through them and reinvestigate these things as though we're studying them for the first time, so that in fact we will be able to dig a little bit deeper, be able to find these little pieces of information that's going to help us further along in our study. So when we are considering the topics of this chapter, and as I said, we're familiar with it, what topics come to mind? Genesis chapter 6. And there's an obvious one, so we can go ahead and get that one out of the way. The flood. What do you have in association with the flood? All right, Noah's Ark. God giving Noah the instructions, all the parameters, all the dimensions, the type of wood, and that he's supposed to follow these different things. God bringing the animals 2 by 2, and that being a miraculous event right there within itself, that Noah did not have to go out and herd these things together, that they're just brought to him. And the doors being closed. God did that. Noah didn't have to close the doors. God shut them in. So we have, I would say, kind of the back end or the back part of the reference when we're considering Genesis chapter 6. But what's at the front of that? What led to that? That's a huge topic in this chapter. All right, wickedness. Sister Sherry, did you say something? All right, sin. Say it loud. Let's go ahead and have some interaction here. Sin, wickedness, absolutely. And just, widespread sin and wickedness and lewdness that's throughout God's creation. Now, on the one hand, while we have sin, wickedness, iniquity, and judgment with the flood, what is another topic that we have being mentioned in this chapter? And if memory serves me correctly, this is the first time that we actually find this topic mentioned specifically. Grace. Very good. So we have man's wickedness, God's grace, but also God's judgment when we're considering all of these points. So when we're considering just from that standpoint of judgment, this is a vital chapter, a very important chapter, because it tells us how it is that judgment originates. Where does judgment come from? Are we sure about that? Now, we need to be careful with how we start, verbalizing and using these different things. God certainly brings judgment. He uses judgment. But why does judgment come? Sin. That's where judgment originates from. If there is no sin, is there any need for judgment? No. The fact that you have sin, there must be judgment, punishment for that. So this is the first execution of worldwide judgment. Now we have a previous judgment earlier on in Genesis chapter 3. Adam and Eve, they're cast out of the garden. That's judgment. And that because of sin. Cain is, mark is put upon him. He's become a vagabond and a wanderer. That's because of sin. Now we have it being shown to us on this worldwide scale of God's judgment, and it's because of sin. Judgment has its origination in sin. Now, even when we're considering that point, if we can go over to, let me check my notes here. When we're thinking about God and judgment and the use of judgment, notice what Isaiah has to say in Isaiah chapter 28, verse 17, and then we're going to jump down to verse 21. And whoever gets there first, if you want to read the first verse, Isaiah 28:17, and then drop down to verse 21, we'll have a prophet give us some information about what God's judgment is.
Judgment also will I lay to the land, and righteousness to the plummet. And the hail shall sweep away the refuge of flies, and the water shall overflow the hiding place.
All right. So here we have in this context is God bringing judgment. Now notice what is said in verse 21.
The Lord shall rise up as in Mount Gerizim. He shall be wroth as in the valley of Gibeon, that he may do his work, his strange work, and bring to pass his act, his strange act.
So how does the Bible describe the judgment of God? It's a strange act. He's going to perform his work, and it's a strange work. Now, why is that? Now, considering who it is that Isaiah is speaking to, he's speaking to God's people. But even when we're considering from the standpoint of Noah, the flood, and destroying the entire world, does God want that to happen? No. Does God desire that any should perish? No, he has a desire that all would come to repentance.
It's kind of what happened when the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. He warned them ahead of time, and I think it was Lot who prayed over and over again if we could find at least some faithful people that the destruction would not come. But we know what happened, and the destruction came. But when the destruction did came, both years and in the flood, I think God kind of said to himself, don't say I didn't warn you.
Well, that definitely can be brought in there. And when we're considering the flood and the judgment that's brought upon the people of the earth at this time, all that is just an establishment of if it's happened once. Now, we know he's not going to flood the world again, but what about judgment? When we're considering God's judgment, if he can judge the world once, what can he do again? He can judge them again. And as Ben mentioned, he does that in Genesis chapter 18. Sodom and Gomorrah is another showing of God's judgment. The children of Israel during the time frame of the divided kingdoms, where he brings in Assyria and Babylon, and they destroy the temple. What is that? God's judgment on the people. AD 70, destruction of Jerusalem, the final destruction of Jerusalem. What is that? That's God's judgment. But when we're considering God's judgment, it really is a strange thing. And even with ourselves, when we're considering judgment being exercised from a physical standpoint, we want justice to be exercised. But when justice is exercised, do we revel in it? Now, we understand that it's a necessary thing. But are we to just enjoy another life being taken? No. And I would say that we need to make sure that we hold on to that aspect of, that we realize this is necessary, but I do not enjoy this happening.
God doesn't take any pleasure in death.
That's right. So if God can look at his creation, and you take just this generation in Genesis chapter 6, Sodom and Gomorrah, whoever it is, those are they're God's creation. They're made in his image as well. And for God to come down and say, okay, enough is enough. There's no pleasure in that. So even when we see justice being exercised and righteousness being brought forth, we need to take a step back from that and say, okay, this is necessary, but I'm not reveling in it. The whole aspect of not rendering evil for evil, rejoicing in others' calamities. And even when you read, for example, I think it's in the book of Obadiah brings about a message of judgment against Edom. And one of the things that God says to Edom as to why their judgment is coming is because they mocked and they laughed when their brothers' punishment came. When Israel was punished, Edom was up in the mountains and in their caves, and they were saying, that's right, give it to them, that's what they deserve. God took note of that. And he said to those people, I'm going to recompense that back to you. It's no different, siblings, when you see another brother, sister, whatever, they're getting spanked. I never enjoyed seeing my brother or sister getting spanked, even if they deserved it. I didn't enjoy it. And we're not supposed to. We understand it's a necessary thing, but it's not something to be gloated in. So with God's judgment, we're considering this from the standpoint of, we're needing to help. It's to help us better understand how it is that God, in fact, handles these situations. Most individuals will look at this section and say, well, this doesn't sound like a very loving God. But when we're considering God's judgment, it's not coming out of fits of rage. God is not up in heaven with his thumb over a button just waiting for us to mess up and saying, all right, I got you, now you're gone. And he doesn't bring about judgment just because he's bigger than we are. Because sin is so rampant, the imagination of every man is on evil continuously. And God just says, enough is enough. And as we touched on last week, how long had it actually been? You're looking at least 2,000 years of history from Adam up to the time frame of Noah. And God's allowed this to go on. And then he lets it go on for another 120 years. And then finally, that's just it. I'm sending forth my judgment upon the earth. So 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9, we have in the New Testament being written to us and explained to us, the Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. That's what makes judgment so strange. It's a necessary thing, but it's not something that God wishes on anybody. And even with the unrest that's going on in our country, I want to see justice. I mean, how many officers were shot in L.A.? They're being hunted in Los Angeles. I want justice. That is just flat out ridiculous. But at the same time, having to step back from that and considering, well, in order to do that, they're going to take a human life. And just to even consider how that we as citizens in this country, having the right to bear arms. And then one of the things when you go through your concealed carry class, the deputies are telling you, when you're at home, you've got to run through scenarios. So what are you actually doing? You're at home and you're running through scenarios about how am I going to take another person's life. If we're not careful, that can be a neutralizing or a numbing type of effect on a person. And you just take, for example, the different ones in the military that have struggles about coming home after being out at war. They turn you into a killing machine. And then you have to try to step back into normal society. Judgment. It's a necessary thing, but it's a difficult thing to be able to handle. So when we're considering, even for example, the final judgment, even though we have a section within our brotherhood that tries to say, well, that judgment's already taken place, That's just purely ridiculous. Because sin is continuing on. So if sin is continuing on, then what does that mean? There must be. There has to be judgment. And in the terms and the way in which the New Testament describes the final judgment that is to come, I just don't see any getting around that as to how it is a necessary thing. And in view of God's character, His hatred for sin, it demands that there will be, in fact, another judgment. Now, when we're considering, brethren, just the whole idea of God's judgment being sent, does God's judgment have to be sent through the means of another nation coming over and conquering another nation? Or could not, in fact, a nation end up destroying themselves from within? I mean, you take, for example, Rome. Rome destroyed themselves from within before somebody else came along. When we're considering what's going on within our nation today, we very well could be, now I'm not a prophet nor the son of one, and I'm not trying to get into conspiracy theories and things of that nature, but we have to take stock of these type of things. What makes our time any different than what Noah was living in? Not a bit, in my estimation. And so it very well could be that with all the turmoil that's going on, surrounded by this election, the virus, and all these different things, I mean, just the fact that you have Marxism, communism running rampant throughout this country, we could very well see this country fall. Now, as to fight against it, I'm on the fence as to what to do, whether it be to try to fight back something that I see as being clearly evil. I mean, we fought communism once during World War II because that just is within itself an inherent evil. But the problem that we have is that we do not have God telling us, okay, yes, go out and fight this fight. Or could it be a situation that we need to run to the mountains? But we need to take these things very seriously as we're seeing them happen. That in fact this could in fact be a form of God's judgment. Can't say one way or the other, but it could be, perhaps, Paul would say. But even as we're considering from that standpoint God's judgment, as we've already said, grace was being extended. And even in Matthew chapter 24 and describing the destruction of Jerusalem, God said that there'd be a span of time where these forces, these things would be pulled back, and except for that, no flesh would be saved. We need to be looking for these things and considering and deciding, what if we need to flee? What if, in fact, we do need to run and repopulate somewhere else, take Christianity somewhere else, out of the United States? Very well could be a possibility. And we're gleaning these type of things from these type of studies. May not like to think about it. I don't like to think about that type of thing. But as we said, it's a necessary thing in order for preparation to be taking place. So grace is being extended to all that will believe and that will obey, but judgment is being brought out for those who will rebel and be disobedient. So again, in Genesis, we have being shown to us a gradual unfolding of God's redemptive plan and God's redemptive principles. Faith and obedience will allow individuals to be able to escape and be transported over into the new creation. And there's going to be a consistency to all of these points if we're able to make it that far this evening. And so we need to keep that in mind, because we are in fact in a time period where within the denominational world there's this movement towards this dispensational form of teaching. I don't know if you've been exposed to it yet, but back in Virginia it was all over the place. And basically what it boils down to, you have Peter and Paul teaching two different gospels. They're in different dispensations. And they would say that we're under this dispensation of grace. Well, this chapter undoes all of that, because you have Noah finding grace in the eyes of the Lord. Now, we understand that we are in the completed section of God's plan of grace, but grace is being found all throughout the Scriptures. And if their position is in fact correct, that's very misleading. Because if their position is correct, then only those that are under this New Testament system could be saved. Can anybody be saved without God's grace? No. So to look back on these individuals and say, well, now we're under this dispensation of grace, they're under this dispensation of works, that doesn't work. That doesn't fit into the principles that God is in fact establishing throughout this section. So the reason why we read of Noah finding favor or grace in God's eyes. Noah is not sinless. We realize that. Though Noah is in fact called perfect. In this text, it references the fact that Noah was upright. He was perfect. Well, perfect how? It's the same way in which we're perfect. We are to have a completion in our character. We are made whole through the gospel, through the sacrifice of God's Son and the redemption that's found in His blood. And we take on His mindset. We take on His characteristics. We take on His being. And thus with Noah and his family, that's what you have going on with them. They are following through with God's will and what it is that God is telling them at that time. This perfection, this completion, it grew out of His righteousness through the provisions that God had in fact made for him. But also in this chapter, we have again being shown to us the danger of mixing, the danger of mingling those that are godly with those that are godless. Now, brethren, I realize that you have some that when it comes to being able to marry somebody who is a non-Christian and being able to bring them over. I think we actually have somebody here within the congregation where that's taking place. God bless you. That's wonderful. But what we're being shown from this chapter is you have how that is in fact an oddity. Where you have the mixing of the two lines, ungodly with the godly, and then only 8 people make it out of that. The odds do not play out in favor. And when we're considering with Seth's line and the righteous line, Cain and wickedness, this bringing about the flood, the intermarrying that took place, you have ungodly homes being produced. And when we're considering the sin that was brought about, that brings about this judgment across the entire earth, it starts with the breakdown of the home. When we're considering our world, our country at this time, we can trace what's happening back to the 1960s. Anybody have any idea as to what was going on in the 60s? What is it? All right, hippie movement. Democrats were really coming into fruition, coming into their reign of power, and what did they end up introducing throughout the 60s and 70s? If I'm reading my material correctly, that's when the welfare state really started ramping up. And you know what the welfare state does? It tears apart the home. Because the welfare system says a single mother can do better on her own in being provided for by the government than to actually have a husband at home providing.
Where does it say that?
What's that now?
Where's the manual that says that?
Well, I'm getting this from Thomas Sowell, who's doing his research and his study with the Howard Society.
Who's the Howard Society?
That's a university here in the United States.
Howard University.
Howard University. Thomas Sowell's he's a doctor. He's a doctorate in economics. And so,
I disagree with what you're saying.
okay, that's fine. Well, I would encourage you to read Thomas Sowell's material.
I don't know Thomas Sowell.
Well, I would encourage you to search him out. Because he's a brilliant man.
I'm
And-
sure there's 100 brilliant men that disagree with Thomas Sowell.
Well, I'm sure that they are, but it all goes back to the facts of it, and he's got the facts. Before the 1960s, even within the...
You're telling me that when you're helping someone else, that's a bad thing?
No, I didn't say that. I'm saying that the extent in which the welfare system does it is a problem.
That happened in the 60s?
That happened up in the 50s and the 60s.
So it's the same as it was today, back then?
That's where it started.
Yeah, that's where it started. It's actually worse from that standpoint.
Didn't the welfare state start back in Social Security, way before the 60s?
Well, no, because you have the...
I thought it was
You have
FDR
the-
that started welfare, actually.
Well, you had well, I might have my dates wrong, but when the welfare system kicked in, that's when the homes started breaking apart. And you can see that for certain. And Thomas Sowell, he does a lot of his research within minority communities. And this situation is not just a minority thing. There's plenty of Caucasians that are caught up in the welfare system today. Before the welfare system came in, majority of the minority homes were sticking together. The freed slaves that were coming out of the South, they were moving north, and they were doing very well for themselves. The homes were staying together. But then the system started kicking in where it was saying, well, we've got to give to these minorities at an alarming rate. And when those things started happening, the homes started falling apart. Now, as I said, I don't have those facts here with me, but I do have the materials where I can get them to you. Well, why would you?
There's a lot of black conservatives now that are preaching that the welfare system contributed to break up the black home because they sent a check to the mother to have unwed mother to have babies and no father there to raise them. And that's just asking for trouble, even regardless of what color it is.
And it's not just a color, it's not a color problem, it's just a people problem. The Bible calls it laziness. The Bible calls it slothfulness. And when you have a system that says, well, we'll just continuously give and give and give and help and help and help, what does that do to incentive? I mean, it does very little. Even with me, I'm trying to get a lot of overtime, but guess what the government does to my overtime? They want to take extra from my hard work. What does that do to my incentive to work? It takes it down. When there's plenty of people, I'm not saying that the entire system is bad. I know that there are people that need help, but oftentimes it's the people that need the help that cannot get the help. And it's the people that know how to work the system that are ones that are raking all these benefits in. And it really is a sad thing.
There's going to be people that take advantage of it.
Sorry, what?
Everything that's ever happened, there's going to be people that take advantage of it.
Well, I agree. And even with the benevolence of the church. Have you not had people that try to come and work the system when it comes to y'all's benevolence? And what do you have to do? Well, cut them off, but I would hope before that you vet them. Well, when's the last time you worked? If you don't work, you don't eat. I don't have to, feel any type of pain or responsibility towards that if you're just a person that's not wanting to work. If you're
Say right after that, if you don't work, you don't eat, then what? We work so we can do what?
Well, we work so we can help those that have a need. Okay, but you can't put those two against one another.
No, it's not.
If a person has a need but they're not actually going out and working, then what about that need? I don't have to fulfill that need if you're not doing your part in it
Perhaps,
to meet up.
perhaps what it could be they need to work.
Well,
Perhaps.
perhaps it very well could be. And many times when it comes to that, well, okay, you're saying that you're needing some money. Well, I've got some leaves in my yard that need to be raked up. Well, no, I don't want to do that. I just want you to give me. Well, I don't have to give you. And even under the Old Testament system, when it came to the leaving of the corner of the fields, what was a requirement? Now, they had to come and get it. I don't have to pack it up and deliver it to you. You have a need, you come and get it. So even God set himself up with a system that says, if you're not going to come get it, you don't have to have it. So this overrunning, overlapping situation of laziness, slothfulness that's going on, it's leading us to all kinds of economical and sociological problems. And that starts within the home. Setting people up with a proper work ethic. That here's what we're needing to do. And that's going to take parental involvement. And as we're seeing just throughout the country, and just so not just within the welfare system, but just across the board, I've seen that the divorce rate has actually gone down. I think it's at about 35 or 40% now. But do you know why that is? people are living together, they're not even getting married. So even with that, we have a problem within the home, where people are coming in, shacking up, producing children, and they don't stick together. There's no responsibility. There is no relationship. There is no bonding factor within this home. And then what happens to those young children? Many of them grow up angry. They grow up frustrated. And they are even, to a degree, doomed to repeat the same cycle. Because why? Because that's what they've grown up in. Now, on that factor, with the job that I have, I do a lot of delivering and picking up in people's homes. So I get to see how a lot of people are living. And I see these little children that are running around these houses, and they're living in squalor. And it puts a huge damper on my day, because I know unless something changes inside of that home, those children are going to grow up and they're going to repeat that, because that's all that they know. So when it comes down to our involvement in the community, we're needing to get information out about how to run your homes. Now, some people might look at that as being meddling or sticking our noses into places where it doesn't belong. But does the Bible not talk about how the home is to be run? How the home is to operate? So that's not us meddling, that's God meddling. But it's simply God just trying to give us how it is that He had hoped for it to be established from the start. You have got to have this set up. A husband and a wife, a mother and a father, to be able to bring up children.
That's God's design.
That is God's design. And we've got a generation that says, well, I can do it without God's design. Now, I understand that some things happen. Husbands pass away unexpectedly. Mothers pass away unexpectedly. What needs to happen during those times? During those times, we have another saying that it takes a village to raise a child. Sometimes that is necessary. If you've got a young child and the father has passed away, what do the other men need to do? They need to come in and give that young child, that young boy, manly influence, manly assistance. Same thing for a daughter if a mother passes away.
That's exactly how I was raised by men of the church.
Godly men able to come in and help with these type of examples. And 5 minutes to discuss the importance of godly mothers. When we're considering the setup of the home, we realize that the husband's to be the head, correct? But just because the husband is the head, we do not need to then start neglecting the important roles that mothership holds. So I wasn't here for Mother's Day, so this is my opportunity to try to get some of this in. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. It came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Now notice it does not say, now this could be, certainly this is possible, but just the fact that the text says that the sons of men, the sons of God, saw the daughters of men, and that they took them to be wives. So not that the daughters of God married the sons of men. So we have some intended emphasis on the vital factor in preserving society, and that comes through the importance of women, the role that they play. Sin entered the world through a woman, and that's because of the influence that she has. Eve influenced Adam to do a thing. And how many women today are able to do that very thing? And just today, Christine and I were visiting a property that we were thinking about possibly renting, and the landlord was telling us that the previous tenant, he was single, and when he was there by himself, he kept the place clean, he took care of things, but then she said sometime along the way, he became a womanizer. And when he started getting all these girlfriends that weren't up to good standards, guess what happened? He's no longer living there. Women play an important role in our society, in our culture. When the role of women, when womanhood becomes corrupt, it lowers the standard of men. religious people allowing the sensual, the fleshly, the temporal to guide them and direct them in marriage. Why does it say that the sons of God took the daughters of men? Does it say because they were so godly? Because they were so chaste? It says because they were fair. That's outside. Well, they just look good. Well, they may look good on the outside, but how are they on the inside? They're not up to par. And we have these things being told to us and set out for us in the scriptures that these things happen, and it leads off in this direction. And so when we're considering about bringing up our young people, I would just flat out hate to be a young lady in today's society. Being bombarded through Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and whatever else form of social media that is going on today, and being told this is what beautiful is. I would hate to have that. And so our young people do not need to buy into those concepts of what the world says, well, this is attractive, and this is what it takes to get a husband. Most of what we're seeing being advertised is in clear contrast and is against what God's Word teaches. And the same goes for young men. Here's what it takes to be an attractive young man, so as to, and even with what we're seeing, they're not even trying to find a mate. They're just trying to find somebody to go home with. So this standard across the board is just not what it's needing to be. And we constantly have this in all forms before our face all the time, 24/7, with those little devices we have in our hands. And when we're considering what the Bible says about information coming in and what that does to us, what did the Proverbs writer say about a man thinketh, so he is? We have to be careful with what it is that we allow to be coming in all the time. We have to put forms of filtration before us. And as we're thinking about trying to keep our young people, that's part of the reason why we have such a hard time of keeping our young people. When we're thinking about the role of parenthood, motherhood, we bring our young people to services, but then what happens when we go home? Do we take these principles home with us and allow them to guide our homes? All right, so we'll stop there this evening. Appreciate very much your attention.